Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, August 12th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way that we keep that going is by relying on listener support from folks just like you. If you want to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week, I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. James Tejani. He is an associate professor of history at California State University, and he wrote a book. It's a new book, and I think it's his first book. It's called A Machine to Move Ocean and Earth, The Making of the Port of Los Angeles and America. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. James Tejani. Well, James, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I am excited to talk about your new book. It is called A Machine to Move Ocean and Earth, The Making of the Port of Los Angeles and America. I think that there are certain topics that we sometimes cover on Talk Nerdy, which are, how do I put this? Ostensibly mundane, but are actually fundamentally important and really, really interesting. Like, I don't know how often people think of ports in their day-to-day life, but I know that a deep dive into this is really necessary for understanding our global economy. So I'm thrilled to talk to you about this. But before we get into the actual topic of the book, I want to learn a little bit more about you. So you are a historian. Is that how you would kind of define your academic focus?
Yes, I'm a historian of the United States.
Okay, so within historians, I guess it's like a history department, there are obviously all sorts of different ways to focus. So a historian of the United States, what brought you to go there? Was it something you were always interested in, or did your academic path shift along the way?
So my interest in United States history begins really with my family. So both of my parents are immigrants to the United States, and I was born here in New York City. And so for me, United States history was always a way to unlock and understand things that my parents didn't, to figure out the society around me, to connect to the society around me, to connect to the people around me, other children, neighbors, people I did or didn't know, and to really set up a claim. I think I had that notion that I was learning things that would lay out the stakes for my family in the United States, and even more so because I'm the eldest child in the family, and I really think that it has done that for me, and that history has that capacity, whether it's learning about our own society or another society. It's the ability of history to connect people and make them familiar to one another. I I have full faith in that capacity, and I think it's one of the downsides of the decline in historical literacy that has kind of contributed to a sense of disconnection.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So you mentioned that your folks immigrated to New York. Where did they immigrate from?
So both my parents were born in India, and they emigrated fairly young in their early and mid 20s to the United States. So they've lived far and away most of their life in the US, and they both became US citizens. But I think for me, I looked to them as parents, and they provided me the guidance they could, but there was always this missing piece of, okay, what are we doing here? How do I navigate coming of age in the society? And that's really where history came in.
Yeah, I'm always really curious about different experiences of individuals who have, I guess, varying levels or varying experiences of acculturation. I know that with some of my friends who are also, um, I guess you could say, of Indian origin but born in the U.S., that there's like a whole, I guess, sub population, that's not the right word at all, subgenre of Bollywood films about that sort of one foot in each culture experience, or having parents who maybe speak Hindi, for example, and where the children speak English and they speak to their parents in English and their parents speak back to them in Hindi, for example. There's so many languages. I'm curious about what some of your experiences like growing up.
Well, it wasn't typically like that. I'd say. So my parents, first of all, they grew up in urban India. So they both grew up in Mumbai, and they were growing up at a time, the 1950s, 1960s, where India was very secular, very Western oriented. I think particularly for urban people. And my father especially grew up in a family that was professional, sort of middle class professional. My grandfather was raised without a father, and I think his mother was a housekeeper. But he became a lawyer and wanted all of his children to be either lawyers, engineers, or doctors. And I think he actually sat them down and gave them the choice of the three. And I had something similar where there were expectations placed on me, and I think that is typical of uh, immigrants from India and their children in this country. But from what I understand, my grandfather was born in the 1890s in India, and he grew up with this sort of urban progressive outlook of being professional and being educated. And so, as a result of that, both of my parents, my father particularly, they went to Catholic schools. The schools were taught um, probably bilingually, but there was a lot of English. Um, and when they became professionals, I think they took on a sort of transnational professional identity to a certain extent. So that had two effects. One effect was that they tempered the Indian culture that they had to a certain degree. They had to be professionals, I think, and they felt that was necessary to be part of their success. So they had a kind of cultural assimilation was sort of their program, growing up in the time period that they did, and coming from a city, a world city. And then the other aspect of that is that because they were professionals, they worked a lot, and they both are physicians. That was their ticket to come to the United States in the early 70s when there were shortages of doctors in the United States. The INS had a foreign doctors program to bring them in under green cards, and they weren't around. So I think what is really interesting is I had that knowledge of them. I had being from somewhere else. I had my interactions with them that were cultural. When they spoke the language that I didn't quite understand, I would only catch a couple words. But when they spoke to each other, the food that they ate, which early on in my life I decided I was not for me, which I think might be typical of some people my age whose parents are from India, um, and who wanted to eat pizza instead.
Right.
Um, and then I think, but there was also this other side of life where they weren't in the house, and uh, I was looking for how I was going to acculturate, and um, a lot of that was filled with television. A lot of that was filled with having friends in the neighborhood, and then an interest in history. came in as well. I think it's a typical and yet atypical upbringing in some ways.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I'm curious if you experienced the sort of, I don't want to call it a bimodality because it's actually not really bimodal, but the sort of stereotyped experience that some, I guess you'd be second generation, right? Second generation children experience where at the beginning there's almost like you said, I just want pizza. I want to be a part of the dominant culture. I want to kind of feel like I am not different from all of my peers and all of my friends. And then later, as you've individuated a little bit, as you've grown up, as you've become slightly more educated, more interested in the stuff of the world, a re emerging interest in your roots, in your parents, in your genealogy, in kind of the origin of your family.
Yeah, sure. I think that's definitely true, and I think um, I got very interested in talking to them about their lives and about what motivated them and how they felt about their connections to a place thousands of miles away and their siblings, many of whom stayed there. Um, and I think where that landed is I very much gravitated to a sort of insider outsider identity. To borrow a metaphor from jazz, an inside out kind of um, identity where I had one foot in the society in which I grew up and that I worked very hard to kind of dissect and understand historically, and another foot outside of it, but in a almost in a nondescript outsider place that India was a part of, but was not the exclusive part of.
It's interesting. I sometimes hear from my patients and even my friends who are biracial, a somewhat similar, probably not quite the same, but a somewhat similar mentality of feeling like I'm not quite in this group. I'm not quite not in this group. I've got one foot over here, one foot over there, but I'm whiter than my black friends or I'm blacker than my white friends. And what does that mean for me personally? That, you know, we're all unique. And even though so much of identity development is all about in group and out group and tribalism, we are who we are and there's nobody like us. But that's a hard thing to come to terms with as an adolescent, for example. And I can imagine that that did influence some of your academic pursuits.
I think so, and in betweenness.
Yeah. That's fascinating. And so, is that why do you think, I asked you before about your interest in history and kind of how it developed, and you spoke about the necessity of history to the democratic process, the necessity of history to just our humanity, but the specific focus on American history. Do you think that that's where that was sort of cemented for you?
I think so because I think as I found and as I dug deep, I found American history to be in many ways boundless, in many ways to have this global reach, this draw to people from around the world, or this attraction to people around the world, this involvement around the world for better and worse. And I think that started me being very interested in American history, but also having this interest in thinking about it on global scales.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that your folks went to New York, but your bio says that you grew up out here where I am in Southern California, and then you sort of went back to New York to finish your PhD at Columbia. What was that transition like? Were you born out here on the West Coast?
No, I was born in New York, and my parents moved to Long Beach, California, when I was 3 years old.
Ah, okay.
So I have some small memories of life in New York as a real little child, but my formative years are in Southern California.
Yeah, I remember when I moved to New York I grew up in Texas and now I'm out here in Southern California. But New York was not only a culture shock, it was a weather shock. It was a climate shock for me, that's for sure. I never quite acclimated to it. Um, do you prefer it out here? Or I don't want to cause any fights with your friends. What brought you back to California? I guess I should ask.
Yeah, so I had to go to New York to as an adult to find out that how much of a Californian I am,
I
and I
love
think
it.
that's something you're speaking to in your experience.
So then, the book that you wrote is about the port of Los Angeles. This is something that is, right in your backyard, right in my backyard. When did you start to develop an interest in that specific topic? Did it evolve out of your academic work?
Yeah, there's two sides of the story. I think I'll or two chapters in the story. And the first does relate to the academic work and the questions that ultimately gave rise to the book project. So I think one thing that is very Californian about this book and its origins is that it begins on a surfboard. Um, so this would be about 20 years ago. And my routine was that I was studying in New York City and I would come home each summer to get my bearings, to get out of New York when it was very hot and humid. And my routine was that I would go surfing each morning, which is something I grew up doing, um, having grown up in Long Beach. And so this would be at the south end of San Pedro Bay, just above Huntington Beach. And the visual of being out there in the mornings was, kind of looking from southwest to southeast. What you're looking at is to the southwest, you've got the two ports, the port of Long Beach and the port of Los Angeles. You've got the Palos Verdes Peninsula. You've got then further to the right, the outer waters of the harbor and San Pedro Bay. And then even further to the left. Um, so you've got the port to the left of that, um, Palos Verdes Peninsula to the left of that, Catalina Island, and the outer waters of the bay in between. And one thing that's very interesting is that in the last couple of years, many of your listeners, many people around the United States and around the world have become familiar with this photographic image of these container ships idled and waiting in traffic to enter our ports and ports around the world. And that visual, even though it's so attached to the pandemic years, it actually begins earlier. It predates COVID, and it begins just in the early 2000s in the first years post WTO expansion, when container ships and imports from China were accelerating rapidly coming into the U.S. Beyond what the ports could handle. So, sitting on my surfboard, I noticed all of a sudden that these container ships were out there in large numbers, just sort of hanging out in ways that they hadn't been before. And so the book project, my academic interests that brought me back to Southern California begin as a way to figure that out. How did that image start? How does it go back in history? And where was it leading us? So my graduate mentor told me that not many research projects start that way on a
On
surfboard.
a surfboard, yeah.
Yeah, so that's
It's
California for you.
yeah, it's an interesting question and an interesting I don't know, so many things start churning in my mind because again, as I mentioned, most people, myself included, we just don't think about these fundamental processes that allow us to have the sort of comfortable and easy lives that we have access to the products that we buy that underlie a lot of the industries that make our lives so convenient. And so you're here, you're able to witness, and most people who live in these communities, right? You're driving by it, you're looking out, and you're seeing these this massive port and all of these container ships coming in. Um, so prior to this, when the port was built, I mean, how old really is it?
So the port, as we know it, there was some use of a harbor before this, but the port as we know it really dates to the 19 teens, is when it's really going to open. They start dredging and building it starting in 1905, but it takes a while. World War One interrupts, and it's going to be operational by the mid teens to the 20s, and then it's going to be, slowly, um, the development of the estuary is going to expand, and then parts of the port are going to be refurbished. So it's an ongoing process. It still is being refurbished, but I would say about 1915 is um, really the point at which it takes off. It's open. The Panama Canal is reaching its completion, and when the Port of Los Angeles was developed, the canal was always it was always the necessity was to grab that moment of the canal opening as well.
Mm. It's such an interesting idea. These what we think of as very, very old, right? 110 years of operation. These very old um I don't want to say simple, but like it's not simple. It's very complex, but technologically, right? Pre-computational, obviously all of these things have been upgraded over time, but that these systems that were in place then, even though they've been refurbished and upgraded, are still in use right now, and still so much passes through this area. I can't help but think about how, like, the railroads, how necessary they are, but how we think of that as such old technology now, but it's like tried and true.
Absolutely, and then these layers of new technology have been built upon it to make it run more efficiently, and with larger scales. But I think very much so. Our global economy is built on 19th century foundations, and that was part of what I was looking for in the book. Were those 19th century roots?
Right. And thinking about how, yes, technology was built on top of it, all this innovation, all of these upgrades. But in terms of physical infrastructure, like a port can only be as big as a port is, and there can only be as many bays as will fit in there, and like just like a train can only go as fast as the engine allows it and the tracks allow it. I cannot imagine. I mean, I live in LA, so I think about the freeways here, and I'm like, these were not built for this many cars. They weren't built for cars of this size. Clearly, the infrastructure is it struggles to keep up with modern demands, and that's something that you were witnessing on that surfboard, isn't it?
Yes, and I think it happens every couple of years. The traffic gets to be too much, and then they have to figure out how to speed up, how to increase the capacity, and get things moving just in time, as they say in the business.
And how, I mean, not only how do they do that, but can they really always do that? I mean, isn't there is a point where it's like no more? We just can't have more capacity than this?
I imagine so, and I think there's some very smart people trying to figure out how to unlock that. But I think what you're pointing to is that ultimately there are these hard realities of physicality, that you inevitably run into, and at a certain point, they become more and more immovable.
Yeah. I'm curious about the landscape in 1905 to 1915, this era when you were talking about, the early infrastructure planning and the dredging and the building. What was what was the region around the port like at that time? What were a lot of people living there? Was it, I mean, even the population was significantly lower then. How I'm trying to envision Southern California in 1915. Can you paint a picture for us?
Sure. So the immediate area that's going to become the port and really become the heart of the port of Los Angeles, and this is going to be true of the what becomes the port of Long Beach as well, is these are estuary and marsh spaces at the core, and there's going to be some areas external to that, particularly for the Port of Los Angeles, that are deeper ocean water that's protected by the combination of the Palos Verdes Peninsula and Catalina Island, sort of making this break, a kind of natural breakwater. But these are estuary spaces, and a lot of this area that is the lower Los Angeles coastal plain is was low lying. It was drainages from the nearby mountains, particularly the San Gabriel Mountains, and so it was very often inundated with fresh water. It was very often flooded seasonally by rain and by snow melt, and as a result, there are going to be large areas of that coastal plain that are not, they're undeveloped. And so it's right by the port, you've got salt marsh, you've got the San Gabriel River mouth. And then as you move further back, you've got freshwater marshes, um, because as the water drains down, comes down the mountains, drains down the plain, it sort of backs up on other water and becomes somewhat stagnant. So lots of marsh.
And I can imagine like a rich habitat, yeah?
Yes, very rich habitat. And so you would have to go further back or to slightly higher land to get areas that would have been inhabitable and developed. And so what you have is you have Los Angeles, that is about 20 miles up from the port area at the time, um, 16 to 20 miles. You've got pockets between there and the coastline of settlements and subdivisions, but lots of open land that would be still at this point ranching, farming, or as you said, habitat.
And was it protected habitat? I mean, I can imagine that when these massive infrastructure plans are first put out there, when prospectors are vying for contracts, when that there's a lot of players, that there are environmental groups, that there are indigenous groups, that there are locals who are like, I do not want this. And then there are, of course, government officials and industry individuals who are like, but this could be great. It could be great for the economy. Like, was it a big fight, or did it happen kind of quietly at the beginning?
Are you asking about the port area specifically, or the area as a whole?
I guess the area as a whole, right? Because it's not as simple as just focusing on the port.
So I think one of the interesting things is that the development of the Los Angeles area and the coastal plain, um, it's hard for us to imagine today, but it happens so piecemeal that I think it people, as they're watching these spaces get developed, there's always somewhere else that is undeveloped, and that always is sort of the consolation to them.
Right. Yeah. How very American, right? This manifest destiny. I can build here. There's so much more land over there. Don't worry about it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the reasons why you don't really start to see that strong environmental consciousness until fairly late in the 20th century, when there's sort of this critical mass of development that strikes people. Um, and to us today, living in a place like Los Angeles, we're sort of like, where did all the open space go? Where did all the habitat go? And it's easy for us to feel that, and to feel that we would say something about it, we would do something about it. But I think it happens so slowly that I found very very few voices that expressed um, uh, protest or even lament over the area that becomes the port. There were bird watching was very popular, sport shooting was very popular, and so those voices they expressed some lament, but I think to them there was somewhere else that they could go to. And so the idea of developing the port, the feeling that this was a necessity, that this was going to make the region sort of come up in the world, it outshone all the sort of impulses people had.
Yeah. What about, I mean, I'm curious if you came across in your research, were there any indigenous groups in that specific area? What was I mean, I don't even know in 1905 or 1915 how I don't even know how to put this into words, how hidden indigenous populations were, right? How forced into like reservation land they were at the time. Did you come across any protest by indigenous groups?
So I would imagine that there were protests, not in the form of organized protests, but I imagine that there were people who voiced that this had been indigenous land. Not too long before we would be talking about, um, in the 19 teens, there are still very, very elderly people alive who remembered at least um, growing up in around the Mission San Gabriel as missionized Indians. So I wrote briefly about the account of one toward the end of the book. One of these people, and so the Gabrielino Tongva, who have a historic claim, an ancestral claim to the Los Angeles area, the coastal plain, and these areas that become developed as these global ports. They are around. They are not on reservations at the time, and they're kind of integrated into the kind of working Spanish speaking classes of Los Angeles society. Um, and some of them are even residing in the area, so they would be working, say, on the Dominguez Rancho, or perhaps the Rancho, the Sepulveda Rancho, the Rancho Palos Verdes, as ranch hands, as day laborers. And I would imagine that they are there. They know their claim to this land. But I think one of the sad things is that if there were protests, they don't get recorded, and they don't find their way into the historical record.
Yeah, that's obviously such a difficulty with history. I just had a woman on the show a few weeks ago who's a classicist and who wrote a book about women in classics, right? And women's perspectives going back to ancient Greece, going back to these historical time periods where women's voices were not recorded. Like, we know that they existed and had brilliant ideas and had thoughts and feelings, but we don't have access to a lot of that perspective. We don't have access to their humanity very often because they didn't have the power and they were not the ones whose stories were being documented. And of course, this is such a tragedy of most of human history, is that many people's voices were never written down.
Absolutely. And that is, as a historian, that's something you have to work with, you have to work against. And so I tried to do that in the book, and I tried to do that with an eye to the descendants of the indigenous people who once called the San Pedro Bay area home, who today have reasserted their claim to the area. And so um, I think trying to see this story through their eyes, at least in part, was a way to recapture perhaps those historic views of 1915 for people who were watching this development and knew that it was erasing or burying their history.
Yeah. And not just erasing and burying their history, not just um kind of like desecrating these I guess you could say natural ecological spaces, and the respect for the land and for the biology of the land, but also, and this is a story as old as time as well, just the sheer amount of capital, the amount of money made with a project like this, and how the individuals who had claims to that land not only didn't see any of that money, but were actively kind of probably um, taken advantage of in the process.
Sure, yeah, it all comes down to who has the legal claim, and not the historic or the emotional or the psychic claim.
Right. And who did have the legal claim? Who technically owned those marshes and those estuaries?
So that is the central question of the story and of the book, is telling that tale. So the area that becomes the heart of the port of Los Angeles, this what I call the estuary of San Pedro Bay, or the San Pedro Estuary, which was the largest estuary between largest coastal estuary between San Diego Bay and San Francisco Bay. So quite significant, about 3,500 acres in size. The major part of that is becomes part of a Spanish and Mexican land grant um, after the in the mid 1780s, and that belongs to the Dominguez family. So it's called the Rancho San Pedro, otherwise known as the Dominguez Ranch. And
Wow. So it's personally owned by an individual family.
yes, and that family has to go through the very difficult process. It's difficult even in the Mexican period of kind of securing their claim against rivals or challengers. But that task becomes even harder in the U.S. era. Um, so they are trying to navigate the post U.S. conquest years in California, um, these years after the Mexican War, when the United States takes California from Mexico, and they are trying to secure that property claim under U.S. law. And the United States government set up a legal process in order to do that. But it was a challenging process, and you had to have the right evidence, the right paperwork. And so, a familiar story, perhaps to some of your readers, is that many Mexican landowners struggle to kind of rise to the evidence based process that the U.S. requires, and that opens the door to other people to take that land or claim it. Interestingly, the Dominguez family is they are quite successful in securing their claim. So they got very lucky in that they were issued a patent by the government of Mexico just months before the U.S. Invasion in 1846. So they managed to have some of the evidence, some of the paperwork they needed, and that is going to make them an exceptional success story.
Yeah, and I'm surprised, honestly, that even that would have been documented. As you know, we think about this it's an American land grab, right? This American goal of securing um, colonies, of colonizing these areas. And I'm quite surprised actually that there was an honoring of such claims. Like you said, it was quite difficult, and probably there were a million loopholes. But um, it's, I don't know, there's something kind of heroic to me about a group of people being able to maintain, but obviously they didn't continue to maintain it. So what happened after that? Did they sell the land? Was the land stolen from them?
Yeah, so let me speak to the comment you just made, and
Yeah.
then we can get to what happens. But I think there is something in this story, to what you said, in which the Dominguez family's ability to navigate this very tricky moment, um, is, you used the word heroic. I think it is something certainly to be admired, and I hope will fascinate readers. The the patriarch of the Dominguez family at the time, Manuel Dominguez, who he sort of asserts his role in the family. He's able to kind of take over the claims of his siblings or buy their claims. He has two sisters. He has to buy them out. Um, and his wife is also, under Mexican law, land remained under a woman's name after marriage, and so even his wife holds claims to land in neighboring areas.
Something
But
else I did not expect. That's good to hear.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
so that's remarkable. That's fascinating. But what I think what's really interesting and compelling about Manuel Dominguez is that he is absolutely determined to secure this property, and he is very strategic in how he goes about doing it. Um, he um, he he's very astute, and he navigates this process. And part of that is he's able to find partners among the American settlers. He integrates with the political elite in Los Angeles. That includes the party elite, the Democratic Party. He integrates with many of these settlers who, interestingly, are Southerners who are coming to Southern California at the time. And he's able to bridge that, and he's able to bridge sort of common business and political interests with them in a way that, in addition to the paper evidence, it shores him up, it secures him. He finds allies. Now, those allies are also out to take advantage of him, but he is able to um, to take advantage of the situation as well.
Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating. And what a, I mean, you know, I think we think of it as a power struggle, but I can't help but think about parallels between, you know, many people have maybe seen the adaptation, the film based on obviously the story with a quite a bit of I guess a literary latitude, but the adaptation of Killers of the Flower Moon, or all of these individual stories that we see of like ostensibly legal wheelings and dealings, but also just knowing that it wasn't a level playing field.
No, and that's where the critical moment in the story is going to come in. So, among the Americans that Dominguez is very active in cultivating as allies is an army officer who is sent out by the U.S. government to conduct these mapping surveys of San Pedro Bay. And his name is Edward Ord. And some of your listeners, and will maybe know his name. He later becomes a famous Union general during the Civil War, quite successful Union general. He ends the war on the staff of General Ulysses Grant. He's really critical in the last moments of the war to the defeat of the Confederacy. But 10 years before that, in the mid 1850s, Edward Ord is sent out by the U.S. Coast Survey to conduct this scientific mapping of the coast. And he's among the so-called allies that Dominguez cultivates. They become friends. Dominguez hires Edward Ord as a surveyor for his own his own hopeful property claims. And Edward Ord is also hired by settlers who know Dominguez, who Dominguez is kind of doing business with. And it is going to be Edward Ord as a government surveyor who who claims the navigable areas of the estuary as United States government property. And he sort of does this under the cover of doing the surveys for Dominguez's business deal. And then
Wow.
the heart of the estuary sort of pulled out of the deal. And guess what? Now it belongs to the US federal government.
Ugh. Yeah, I saw that coming too. Like, what a betrayal! What a I mean, it's sad that it's easy to predict that that was a tactic, because it's probably a story. This is a specific story about this specific area, but this story probably recapitulated so many times.
Certainly. And I think with it's really the story of United States conquest of the former Mexican provinces. And then, of course, it's the story of U.S. negotiators and Native American claims all over the place.
It's
I,
even the story of emancipation. I mean, when we were looking at Reconstruction, right? Like offering legal claims and taking them back away. It's very often the story of taking advantage of vulnerable people using the power of executive order.
yes, yeah, that's another great metaphor. I think what's really interesting in those moments is that I saw this by looking at Edward Ord, and I want to say this so that he comes across as a complex figure and not the villain of the story.
Right, clearly, because this was a man who you said helped win the war for the Union.
Yeah, so I think I think readers have to reckon with that. That this is someone who, in the clutch moment of his generation's lives, he makes the right decision and he sides. He throws his lot with the right side in the Civil War, um, and that's quite to his credit, and he should be remembered for that. I think even earlier, there's something about Edward Ord that I think speaks to this moment, and it speaks to this pattern of vulnerable people being taken advantage of, which is that in the mid 1850s, when Ord is about to do this take this action that's going to pull the heart of the estuary out from Dominguez's property, out from his grasp, and Dominguez believes it's his already at this point, um, because the one element of the government has told him it will be. Um, Edward Ord is really interesting because you can see this motivation that he believes there's enough here for everybody, and so if I take this piece of land from Dominguez, he still gains. I'm still helping him. We are still sort of friends.
And I'm not letting down my bosses.
I'm not letting down my government bosses. I'm not letting down my other U.S. settler employers. And then on top of that, Edward Ord is also he's angling to try to get a piece of it for himself.
Of course.
And what's really interesting there is I think there's not a notion of equal benefit, but there is a notion that we can all benefit somehow here. And if I benefit more than you, well, maybe I deserve it. And that's what you start to see in the details of the story.
Oh, it's fascinating. And I have a question that's probably going to feel a bit like an aside, but I think it's necessary to clarify. Was this even a good place to put this thing? Like you mentioned that most of this land you couldn't even build on. It was like marshy and boggy and it was an estuary. And you also mentioned that it was the largest estuary between, San Diego and San Francisco. There's a lot of coast in between there. Like, why is this the place for the port?
Yeah. So very interestingly, Ord's government bosses, the United States Coast Survey, who are these he's an Army officer who is has some training from West Point in the basics of surveying and mathematics, but he is not a professional coastal surveyor, and he's particularly not a professional um, geodesist, a practitioner of the science of geodesy, which is the very complex mathematical process of making these long distance measurements and maps that um, account for the curvature of the Earth. That takes a lot of skill. It takes a lot of experience with astronomy, with precision instruments. Like I said, with very very um, micrometer kind of mathematical work and
Right.
repeat
Like
it
this is pre GPS, people. Like, yeah, this is hard work.
pre GPS, pre calculators, pre computers, and these people, they have to do these mathematical computations not once, but they have to do them dozens of times to check for errors. And so Ord does not have that experience. He's really kind of an underling. His government bosses who have the experience, who are these scientists, they're like, no way, this is not the place for a harbor. And so the other main character in the book is a man named George Davidson, and so he is that guy. He is that scientist who views this part of the coastline um, very dubiously, and certainly the estuary. It's too shallow. It's too treacherous, and so he just does not believe this is going to be a harbor. And it's the arc of Davidson's life that he lives long enough to see it become a harbor and see himself proven wrong. And what? Go ahead.
I can't help but think of parallels with I remember watching a PBS documentary recently about the Everglades and just like all of the dumb stuff that happened in the Everglades, like early on when they were attempting to develop and put in, whole communities among this river of grass and pumping out water and just trashing the area like some sort of, I don't know. I can't help but see like the misogyny in it, like just this like big dick contest of like, I will build here. And it's like, this is a bad idea. Like, not only are you destroying nature to do that, nature is actively going, I'm not going to let you.
Yeah, and it's not good science. And
Right.
what the interesting thing about the story is that you constantly have these boosters, these land speculators who what they care about is the making of money, the capital motive. And you have on the other side of that, the scientific motive, that the person who is really concerned about safety, in a place like the Everglades, like, is it safe to put up a building here? How is it not going to collapse? And that conflict is really at the heart of the story of George Davidson and Edward Ord. But what's going to be interesting is that the boosters, the potential money makers, they have a stroke of luck in that eventually, by the very late 19th century, the technology is going to develop, the dredging technology, by which the kind of old science is going to be cast aside. George Davidson is going to be cast aside. He's going to essentially become irrelevant to the world he helped to create. And the dredging is going to make possible this idea, well, we can just build it anyway. We're going to dig it out. We're going to pour concrete everywhere. And now it's suddenly is going to work. And so they win that contest.
Yeah. Ugh. It's so I'm at a loss right now as to where to put the ellipses on this story with you. We're like running out of time, so that's like an external pressure that helps me know when to end the conversation. But usually there's sort of an obvious time to say, "Wow, that was really interesting," and read the book. But I'm like, "Oh, what else do we talk about?" Or is this just a dot dot dot? Um, how did you even know when you were writing this story how to stop writing the story?
So for me, the end point of the story is the point at which two things two things happen. So the first is going to be the emergence of the United States as a global power, it's no longer a young nation finding its legs, nearly collapsing into civil war, and trying to pick up the pieces, but it starts to become this nation that is projecting its power through the hemisphere and into the world. So it's the story of United States globalism and imperialism that starts just around the year 1900. And the second half of that, the end point of the story of imperialism, is how the city of Los Angeles is able to seize that moment with this new artificial port and become a sort of Pacific Coast capital of that new U.S. globalism in the 20th century. So that was one endpoint. And the second endpoint was the destruction of nature, when the estuary that had really been the heart of the cause of the story, the cause for human action. And I really believe that, and I tried very hard to keep the estuary as a sort of silent character in the book, that it's really what's making things happen. This resource of nature that nature had put here on the coastline. Once that's destroyed, and once it's destroyed by no longer by individual people, but by technology, by this kind of mass society, that to me was the end point of the story.
And it's so sad thinking about the fact that you and I and every single person listening to this podcast came into existence after that collapse, and we don't get to know the gifts of you know the ecology of that region, the natural sort of wonder. We don't get to know about all of the plants and animals and different organisms that were thriving there. They're just done. They're gone. It's as if they never existed.
Yes, they are gone, and that space is gone. I hope that readers will take away from the book an appreciation for those kinds of spaces and go see them where they do exist. Even the remnant estuary spaces that do exist still in Southern California. Um, I hope they'll go out and see them and find that those are familiar places, and those are places that have not only this natural beauty and value, but that have made this very important contribution, like you said at the beginning of the interview, in creating this material world of global trade and imports and comfort and convenience and luxury that we enjoy. Those spaces were traded away, but yet they are part of that story and part of our remembrance.
Yeah, yeah. And now of course, I mean, this is my backyard, this is your backyard, but even for people living halfway across the country, maybe even halfway across the globe, they are affected by the Port of Los Angeles. Like I don't know if I really understand the scale of this port. Can you help us understand, maybe here in these last few minutes, the impact, the how it affects our lives, what how big it is, what comes through there?
So the combination of the two global ports of San Pedro Bay, the port that's administered by the city of Los Angeles, and the adjacent port administered by the city of Long Beach, together those ports account for 1/3 of all U.S. imports.
Jeez.
And that's an astounding amount of goods, coming in on those containers, moving on trucks, ending up in warehouses, ending up on store shelves. And it's difficult to trace the exact movement of goods. There are other ports around the country that serve as an entry, but I think that either directly or indirectly, simply by its example that this can be done, that this kind of a world can be created, the Port of Los Angeles touches the lives of all Americans. And as I write in the book, everywhere around the world, we have a port somewhere that's doing this, that's giving us the clothes we wear, our devices, the laptop that I'm speaking to you on right now. And so we have this intimate, ongoing relationship with these places, these ports, as they shape our society, they shape our material lives. We know them vaguely, but we really should know them much better and much more than we do.
Absolutely. It's fascinating. I just want to thank you for taking the time to share this story with us, obviously taking the time to share the story with everybody by immortalizing it in text, but also spending your time with us today to share this story that I don't know if I ever would have even thought about. I'm always so grateful when I have the opportunity to dig deep and to expand my knowledge, especially about topics that are so fundamentally important, but that I have, I'll say it, like the privilege of not ever really having to think about. I'm glad that I was able to take some time, that you were able to share this time with us today to help us gain an appreciation for that privilege in our life. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's been my privilege, Kara, and I am grateful to you for what you do and giving me this opportunity to speak to you.
Absolutely. Everyone, the book is A Machine to Move Ocean and Earth, The Making of the Port of Los Angeles and America by Dr. James Tejani. James, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kara.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.